Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive. We are going to be tackling some seriously big questions today.
Oh, I love a good big question.
Oh,
What are we thinking about today?
we're going to go from like the morality of different cultures to
Mm,
like Buddhism in a world that's kind of, well, a little crazy.
I'm with you.
And we'll even see how Looney Tunes fits into all this.
All right, now you've got my attention.
Our sources this time are, well, they're all over the place. Blog posts,
The
articles,
usual suspects.
yeah, and then some philosophical quotes too.
Love those.
And even a movie review. Get ready for some pretty wild connections because today
We're going deep.
we are definitely going deep.
You know what strikes me is that even though these sources are so different, like you said, they all kind of circle around the same thing. Like, how do we figure out our place in the world?
Mm,
You know, on our own, but also as like part of society as a whole.
that's such a good point. And speaking of making sense of the world, there's this article from After Dinner Conversation that really got me thinking.
Okay, what's the article about?
It's all about this concept called moral isolationism. Basically, it says judging the morals of other cultures might be a total waste of time.
A fool's errand, even. It's a really interesting idea.
Yeah, right.
The article basically argues that we can only understand the morals of other cultures through our own experiences,
Yeah.
which makes sense, right? We all have our own biases.
Yeah.
It suggests that what looks wrong to us could be completely normal in another culture because they have different values and traditions.
Totally. It's like using the wrong formula for a math problem. You'll never get the right answer that way. So think about this. Have you ever come across something in another culture that seemed wrong at first, but then when you learned more about the context, you thought, oh, okay, I get it now. It's hard to balance our own moral compass with the fact that different cultures have different ideas about what's right and wrong.
You know, that ties into this blog post from Love of All Wisdom called Disengaged Buddhism in the Second Era of Trump.
Oh, interesting.
And without getting into any political stuff, it asks this really fascinating question.
I'm listening.
How should people with strong spiritual or philosophical beliefs, engage with a world that feels, well, morally questionable sometimes, especially when things are a bit chaotic?
It's a question a lot of us struggle with, right? How do we stick to what we believe in when everything around us seems to contradict those beliefs?
Exactly. It's like, do we just retreat into our own little spiritual bubbles?
Mm,
Or is there a way to engage with the world without compromising our principles?
I think it's a tricky balance.
Oh, for sure. And maybe part of that balance is realizing that the world is a complicated place. There aren't always easy answers.
Yeah, it's about embracing the gray areas.
Exactly.
Okay, let's switch gears for a second and talk about this post from Extinct Blog that explores nature vibrating with rhythms.
Oh, this sounds intriguing.
It focuses on this concept called periodic diastrophism, which might sound kind of intimidating.
Astrophism.
Yeah, it's essentially about how the Earth's crust gets deformed on a huge scale.
So, like how mountains and valleys are formed?
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that this idea was super popular back in the early 20th century.
I wonder why that was.
Well, it wasn't just a scientific theory. It felt like it reflected a bigger cultural thing at the time, this fascination with cycles and patterns, both in nature and in human history, almost like people were trying to explain the crazy events of their time.
They needed something to make sense of it all.
Exactly. This idea that the Earth itself goes through these cycles of like huge upheavals and change, well, it really resonated with them.
It does make you think, doesn't it? Like,
Yeah.
even scientific theories, even the ones that seem super objective, they can be influenced by what's going on in society at the time. The anxieties, the prevailing worldview.
It really shows how science and culture are connected. They kind of feed off each other.
For sure.
All right, let's switch gears again and talk about something that's always relevant: money. More specifically, wealth inequality. There's a blog on Reason and Meaning that asks this question head on. Does wealth inequality matter?
Ah, that's a big one.
The author, Martin Butler, he looks at the UK and the USA specifically.
Okay.
He's trying to figure out if wealth inequality is just inherently wrong or if there are times when it might be okay.
That's a tough one.
Right.
I mean, he looks at arguments from both sides. He says some level of inequality might be unavoidable, like it's just part of how things work. But he also recognizes that when the gap between the rich and the poor gets too big, well, that can cause some serious problems.
Yeah, it's like that saying, a rising tide lifts all boats. But what if some of those boats are yachts, and some are just tiny little rafts barely staying afloat?
Right.
Is it just about how hard people work or how lucky they are? Or are there bigger forces at play that create and maintain these disparities?
I think those are questions we're still grappling with as a society.
Totally. And if there are these bigger forces, do we have like a moral duty to try to fix things?
That's a question we all have to answer for ourselves, I think. But one thing's for sure, if we just ignore the problem altogether, that's a recipe for disaster. Social unrest, instability, you name it.
No one wants that. And thinking back to that idea of disengaged Buddhism we were talking about, it makes you wonder, how can people, no matter what their beliefs are, reconcile their own personal wealth with the fact that so many others are struggling just to get by?
That's a tough one. It reminds me of this quote by Thomas Paine. It's from Philosophy Bits. A long habit of not thinking a thing wrong gives it a superficial appearance of being right.
Wow, that is a powerful quote. And it makes you think about how what's considered normal changes so much over time.
It really does.
Things that were once totally accepted, like slavery or denying women the right to vote, they seem unthinkable now.
It shows how much our moral compass can evolve and how important it is to keep challenging our own assumptions and biases.
Because what might have seemed okay in the past can look very different through today's lens. And sometimes it takes like a real push, a passionate protest against inert ideas, as another philosopher from Philosophy Bits, Alfred North Whitehead, put it, to bring about those shifts in how we think about morality.
It's about being brave enough to question what we've always been told is right. Sometimes the most important progress comes from shaking things up a bit.
I love that. Okay, let's look at another quote that gets at how complicated human nature is. François de la Rochefoucauld, also from Philosophy Bits, said, "Passions often engender their opposites."
Oh, that's a good one. It suggests this fascinating paradox in human behavior. Our strongest emotions can actually give birth to their opposites.
It's like we swing from one extreme to the other.
Think about it. Have you ever just exploded with anger after being forced to stay calm for too long? Or maybe you felt incredibly generous right after being super stingy.
Oh, totally. I've definitely gone on a crazy shopping spree after weeks of being super careful with my budget.
It's like you're overcompensating for all that self-control.
It's wild how those opposite feelings can exist within us at the same time.
From a psychological point of view, it could be our way of finding balance. Our minds and bodies always want to even things out. So when we push too hard in one direction, we naturally swing back the other way.
Like a pendulum. But then what does that mean for how we make decisions? Are we just stuck being controlled by these emotional swings?
It's a great question. And it leads us to think about language. How much power it has over how we see the world. There's this quote by Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and he says, "Speech is not a means. It contains its own rule of usage, ethics, and view of the world."
Whoa. Okay, that is deep. It's like our language isn't just how we communicate. It actually reflects what we value, what we believe, how we understand everything around us.
And especially in today's digital world where we do so much communicating online, it makes you think about how our words reveal who we really are.
Even in casual conversations online.
Yeah, even then. It's like our online selves are extensions of our real selves. And our language choices, whether we realize it or not, they give people a glimpse into our inner world.
It's kind of scary to think about that, actually.
I know, right?
But if language really shapes how we see the world, does that mean our beliefs aren't even really our own? Like, are we just products of the language and culture we grew up with?
That's a really interesting question. And it brings us to a quote by Friedrich Schlegel, also from Philosophy Bits. At the words, "His philosophy, my philosophy," one is always reminded of that line, "Who owns God?"
That's a great quote. It makes you question where your beliefs really come from.
It definitely challenges us to examine the roots of what we believe in.
Wow.
Like, are we just blindly following what we've been taught? Or are we truly figuring things out for ourselves?
It's tough to separate your own beliefs from everything that's influenced you, though.
It is. It's a lifelong process. And it requires us to think critically.
And to question everything.
Yeah, question everything. Be open to different viewpoints.
It's like constantly be in learning mode.
Exactly. It's like peeling back the layers of an onion. With each layer you peel, things get more complex.
Oh, I like that analogy. And speaking of questioning everything, Alfred North Whitehead said, "Every intellectual revolution has been a passionate protest against inert ideas."
Inert ideas. I like that. So how do we figure out which of our ideas are holding us back? Where do we even start challenging those ideas? It's not always easy. These inert ideas, they often pretend to be the absolute truth. They're so ingrained, we rarely even question them.
They're everywhere, too.
Oh, for sure. In our culture, our politics, our religions, even our families.
So basically everywhere.
Yeah, pretty much. The challenge is to develop those critical thinking skills and then, just as importantly, to have the courage to face those ideas head on, to
Uh,
examine them from different angles, to be willing to let them go if they're not doing us any good anymore.
it's like we need to do a mental spring cleaning every now and then.
Oh, I love that.
Get rid of all the dust and cobwebs of those ingrained beliefs and let in some fresh air. But what happens when the very foundation of our beliefs, our memories, turns out to be, well, not as solid as we thought?
Oh, that is a good question. And a perfect segue into our next source. A Booker Prize-winning novelist, Julian Barnes, explores that very idea in a piece he wrote for The Guardian. Barnes, he really digs into the whole idea of memory. Like, can we ever really trust our own memories, or do they get all mixed up with our imagination and how we reinterpret things over time?
It's like, what if the stories we tell ourselves about our own lives aren't even that accurate?
Right. He's basically questioning if our personal narratives are actually objective. He suggests that memory itself is this fluid, subjective thing.
That's kind of unsettling when you really think about it. Like, our memories are so important to us. They're how we define ourselves.
Exactly. And if they're not as reliable as we think, what does that mean for our beliefs, for our whole worldview? It's a big philosophical question.
It's like trying to build a house on shifting sand. Okay, let's switch gears to a topic that's a little sensitive, maybe even a bit of a trigger warning. We're going to be talking about something called rape by fraud. A philosopher's blog has a post that really dives into this.
Oh, that's a tough one. So this post is basically grappling with the question of consent. Like, if someone gets your consent by deceiving you, is that consent even real?
Yeah, it's tricky because it makes you think about the boundaries of deception and how much it can hurt someone emotionally and psychologically.
It's a situation where what's legal and what feels morally right might not be the same thing.
It reminds us that the law doesn't always understand the nuances of human relationships, like how much betrayal and deception can really damage someone.
It's definitely an area where we need to keep having conversations. Figuring out the ethics of sex and relationships, especially as our society keeps changing.
Totally. And speaking of how societal norms change, the same blog also has a post called Blackface Revisited. It looks at how blackface started and why it's seen as so clearly racist today, at least in the US.
Yeah, this post goes all the way back to the minstrel shows in the 19th century. Back then, white performers would wear black makeup and really exaggerate stereotypes to make fun of African Americans.
It's crazy how those portrayals were used to justify discrimination and the horrible treatment of black people.
It's a good reminder that even things that seem harmless, like entertainment, can be used to spread harmful ideas, and that those ideas have real consequences in the world.
It shows how important it is to understand history, right? What might have been okay in the past is definitely not okay now.
Exactly. We have to keep learning and growing.
Okay, let's move to something a little more positive now. There's a post on Sacerdotus that reflects on the second Sunday of Lent readings. It talks about God's promises, the importance of personal transformation, and seeking guidance both internally and from a higher power.
That's beautiful. And the post actually connects those traditional religious ideas to what's happening today. It draws a parallel between the Transfiguration and some recent astronomical events. It's like those events could be seen as modern-day signs of God's power.
It's a really interesting way to connect those ancient stories to our own experiences. It makes you wonder if maybe we see signs of the divine in everyday life, but just don't recognize them.
Right. It's about finding that spiritual meaning in the world around us.
Now, on that same blog, there's also a discussion of something that's a bit more controversial within the Catholic Church, the traditional Latin Mass.
Yeah, and the author of the post actually pushes back against the term TLM itself. They think it creates unnecessary division within the church. They're arguing that the Mass is theologically the same, no matter what form it takes.
So they see terms like TLM and Novus Ordo as divisive and maybe even against the church's teachings.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that even within a single religion, people can disagree on some pretty fundamental stuff, and that it's important to have respectful conversations about those differences.
Even when those conversations get tough. But isn't TLM and Novus Ordo pretty common language these days? It seems like that's what many Catholics call them.
Oh, absolutely. And that just shows how powerful language can be. Even if it's unintentional, it can shape how we see things and even create divisions between people.
The author is basically asking us to think about the words we use, to focus on what unites us instead of what separates us.
It's a good message for everyone, not just Catholics.
Okay, let's end on a lighter note. Sacerdotes also has a movie review of The Day the Earth Blew Up, a Looney Tunes movie.
Oh, I love Looney Tunes.
Me too. And the reviewer talks about how much fun they had watching it with their family. It's a nice reminder that sometimes the simple things in life are the most meaningful.
Like laughing together and just enjoying each other's company.
Exactly. It's so important to have those moments of joy and connection, especially when the world feels so complicated. But it does make you think maybe there's more to a Looney Tunes movie than meets the eye.
I think you could say that about a lot of things. You know, art and storytelling have a way of sneaking in these deeper ideas and emotions.
Even in cartoons. So maybe Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck do have something to teach us about life after all. It really is amazing how much those cartoons can make you think. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the big takeaways for our listeners? What should they think about?
Well, we definitely covered a lot of ground today. I mean, we talked about everything from moral relativism to, how to engage with a world that doesn't always line up with your values.
Right, and then there's the cyclical nature of history, how what's normal is constantly changing, the power of language, those unreliable memories.
Oh, and the ethics of consent and deception.
Yeah.
It's been quite a ride.
It really has. But if we had to pick one central theme, one big idea to take away from all this, what would it be?
That's a good question. I think it all boils down to critical thinking. All these different sources, they're really pushing us to question our assumptions, to look at things from different angles, and to be open to the idea that our first impressions might not be the whole story.
It's about recognizing that the world is complicated, that there's not always a simple right or wrong answer.
Exactly. And to be willing to change our minds when we learn something new. To have those tough conversations, even when it's uncomfortable.
Absolutely. And that brings us to a final question, one that we didn't really talk about directly, but it kind of emerges from everything we've discussed. If, as Julian Barnes suggests, our memories are so fluid and unreliable, how do we even begin to build our own personal philosophy, our worldview? How can we be sure of anything when the very ground we're standing on might be shifting?
That's such a great question. It's almost like we're being asked to navigate a world where the map is constantly being redrawn. Kind of scary, but also exciting in a way.
I think so too.
I think what it means is that building your own philosophy isn't about finding the one right answer or clinging to some rigid set of beliefs. It's more about embracing the journey, about constantly questioning and reflecting, and accepting that our understanding of the world and of ourselves will probably always be changing.
It's like being a lifelong student, always learning, always growing.
Exactly. So for everyone listening, as you continue to explore these ideas, keep that sense of curiosity alive. Don't be afraid to challenge what you think you know, to see things from different perspectives, to let your beliefs evolve as you learn and experience new things.
And remember, learning is a lifelong adventure. There's always something new to discover and discuss.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. We'll see you next time for another exploration of fascinating ideas.